Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. For today I thought I would do a more real-time tutorial again, and I'm just going to be speeding up the repetitive parts here. All the items that I'm using will be down in the description below. I am using my new Graham paints for this. And the first thing you're seeing me do here is just wet the background. Now in real time this took probably between 2 to 3 minutes because I really wanted it to be nice and wet. And you just see me there tilting the paper a little bit just to make sure that all the parts of the paper is nice and wet. And we want it to be shiny, the paper shiny, but not soaking wet, like no puddles. Now I'm taking the quinacridone rose and I'm just sort of starting to sprinkle it on with my brush. But I will go on and tap some bigger areas on because I found these little sprinkles were just a little bit too small, but that's what I'm starting to do now. And then I'm going to go in with my sap green and I'm doing the same thing. And just for this repetitiveness of the background, I'm going to speed it up just a little bit, but I'll try to keep our bird completely in real time so you can see exactly what I'm doing. So here you're seeing me just doing those bigger dabs because I want a little bit more color. The background of this bird, there is some really beautiful like flowers coming off of the branch, so I kind of really want to imitate that in a looser way because the background's going to look weird right now, but once we get the bird in and the bird's going to have a little more detail, the looseness of the background's going to make sense. And I'm just going back in with that quinacridone rose, doing the same thing, doing some bigger taps here and there just to make it look like those flowers from the background. Now I'm going in with some of my phthalo blue. And I'm just sprinkling this and I'm doing it a little bit small like I was at the beginning. And this is going to be the same blue that we're using on the bird. So I just want a hint of that in the background. And also with my azo yellow, I'm doing the same thing. And I'm just taking a little bit more of that sap green, just so I have a little bit darker of a color towards the front, and the colors from before kind of faded out into the background a little bit. And I'm going to do the same with the quinacridone rose. And a little bit more of that phthalo blue and the azo yellow. And I'm just taking a Kleenex and tapping off any of the colors that got on our bird, but that really doesn't bother me. And then I'm going to take just a smidgen of permanent alizarin crimson, just to have a little bit of a brighter red color in there, and I'm just putting this in a couple little places. So then we're going to go ahead and I took a little bit of the water and splashed it on the background to see if I could create some blooms, but I didn't have quite enough paint on there to get that effect. And then we're going to go ahead and just let the background dry. So I'm starting with that phthalo blue, and this is going to be the main blue that I use for the blue of the bird. So I'm focusing that on the top part of the beak, where we've got a little bit of the blue shadow coming in from the beak. And then I'm using this color to go in and starting to put in his feathers. Now I'm not worrying about laying down the feathers right now. You'll see me where they kind of transition from the white area to the blue. I am, making little tiny feathery marks. But for the main body of the blue areas, I'm just putting in the flat color. And then I can come on top with a little bit of a darker blue to just create, the feel of some feathers in there. I'm sort of not looking for a completely realistic, version of the bird here where you would have every little feather that you could see. but I want you to get the feel that there's some feathers there. So we'll do that later on, but right now I'm just laying the coloring down pretty flat. Just taking a little bit of water too, and just lightening that little area on his tail as well, just so it'll blend in, transition nicely to the other color we'll put there. So I'm just trying to get that blue into all the areas where I see it on the bird. And you'll see here where it kind of transitions to other colors. I am making like little flicky motions with my brush, but I'm not worrying too much if it looks completely like feathers. I just want it to have sort of a little transition between the blue and the white and the blue and the yellow that we'll put, and also the blue and the black. So I'm just leaving little tiny gaps in between my brush strokes where those areas meet, and that's going to give the impression of feathers coming off the bird. Now I'm taking a really watered down version of that blue, and that's what I'm going to use for the shadows in the white areas. So I'm just going in and I'm not really worrying too much if it looks like feathers. I'm sort of going to make a little bit bigger strokes just to make it look like there's some shadows in that area. So I'm doing this on top of his head and then underneath his eye area a little bit. And I don't want to completely cover all the white area here. And if you're not sure if your color's light enough or dark enough, you could always have a little scrap piece of watercolor paper nearby that you could test it on, so that you're not, going on too dark and then you're going, oops, that needed to be lighter. I would also have a little Kleenex like you see. I have one nearby, so that if you put the wrong color down or if it's a little too dark, you can always grab that quickly and dab it off and then put the right color, So those are some little tips for you to do as well. And I'm also taking that watered down phthalo blue, and I'm putting that down between where his base of the body ends and his little legs start. There's a little bit of a blue in that area. Sort of like a blue-green, so we'll add a little bit of yellow there after, but we're going with the blue for now. So I'm taking that azo yellow, and this is the color that we're going to use in his breast area. And as it gets down towards the base of his belly, we're going to make the color a little bit darker. So again, I'm just starting with those flicky motions, but this part doesn't really matter because when you come with the black area, you can always use the black to overlap the yellow and do that. So for a looser type bird like this, we really want to focus on our lights and our darks in the bird. And I say that with a lot of pieces that we're doing, whether it's realistic or more loose. It's your lights and your darks that's going to create the shape of the bird and help it look more realistic, even though we're not putting in every little feather and every little detail. So that's another thing that you can focus on when you're doing artwork like this. And I'm just going to speed this part up here just a little bit because it is a little repetitive. I'm just putting that yellow in, here on the outside of the bird. I am making a little bit of flicky motion so it looks like the feathers are kind of coming off of him a little bit. And I'm just bringing that yellow down. Now here I'm taking a little bit of the new gamboge, and this is a Daniel Smith color. And that's what I'm going to use to darken up this color. So I'm using both the Azo Yellow and the New Gamboge, and that's going to create a little bit more of a shadowed yellow. And that's what I'm going to use for the base of his belly. And I'll just drag that color down. And there I'm just using my other brush that is damp but not wet, just to help transition the two colors. Now because the Azo Yellow is wet as we're putting this down, those two colors will blend together nicely, but because the paper's not wet, they won't travel so far. So when you're doing wet on wet, the colors will travel, and when you're doing more wet on dry, they won't travel as much. So those are the two techniques that I'm using here. And again, just making those little flicky motions to the outside, just to give a little hint of some feathers coming off of him. And also at the base of him, he's got a couple little feathers, like not really feathers, almost like little fuzz coming off. So I'm indicating that. And I just grabbed a little bit more of that new gamboge color to make it a little bit darker right at the base. Now I've left that area on his breast because that's a really dark area, but you could always just go right over top of it and then the dark color would go over top of that easily. So I'm going back to that phthalo blue and I'm just adding it here and there, more in the shadows because I feel like they need to be darkened up just a little bit. More closer to the inside of his face, and I'm leaving the feathers, towards the more outside, a little bit whiter. And just bringing that color back down to his legs. Now here I'm taking sepia. It's just out of camera shot, but I'm also putting this into the top part of his legs, and then this is going to be our main color for the branch, because the colors of the branch are kind of reflecting into his legs as well, so that's why I'm putting that color there too. So here I'm taking some neutral tint because I wanted it to be dark but not super dark as like lamp black. And this is what I'm going to use for the darker feathers on his little tummy there. And then to make the shadows pop even further, I will go back in with the lamp black once everything's dry. And here I'm just, doing those flicky motions towards the outside where it transitions into the yellow. And in the inside, I'm just laying the color down pretty thick. Now I'm making sure to leave a couple of those little yellow feathers showing through here and there, so I'm not covering everything up completely. And I'm also taking that neutral tint and I'm putting it on the bottom side of his tail. And then I'm going to take some clean water and just help blend it with the blue. So you'll see me take the water there and then I'm just blending it through because it's just a little bit darker to show the underside of the tail. And I'm just using that neutral tint to darken up just a little bit on the bottom half of that tail. And then I'll go in with that blue just because I want it to be a little bit brighter right on that like upper edge. And the two colors will transition nicely there since it's a little damp but not too wet. And I'm just bringing that blue up into the yellow area just a hint because it looks a little green there in the reference photo. So I'm just letting the two colors mix slightly to create that little bit of green area there. So now I'm taking that sepia and I'm going to start working on the branch. And I'm getting it, you know, a nice, not super wet, but not super thick, sort of like a cream consistency. And I'm just going to fill the branch in with that color. And I'm starting between his 2 feet. Because the branch is broken up nicely, we can sort of work on the middle area and then the 2 outside areas. So that's what I'm going to do here. And I want the paint to stay a little bit wet on the branch because I'm going to come in and drop in some of that neutral tint for the shadows on the branch. And I want the colors to stay nice and vibrant, so that's why I'm not putting water down first. I'm using the sepia sort of as the watered part. And you'll see me take that neutral tint now. And I'm just going to drop it in between his little toes and on the top part of the branch. And just let the colors mix together. Okay, now I'm going to do the exact same thing for the left side of the branch and the right side, but I'm just going to speed it up slightly because it's going to be the exact same process. So I want that sepia to stay a little bit wet so I can drop in those colors. Now here, because I want the outsides of the painting to look like it's not so much in focus, I did put a little bit of water down just towards the very outside of the branch and let that sepia bleed out. And I'm not going to put the neutral tint in that area. And you'll see me just dropping it in now, but I'm stopping it about halfway down that side of the branch so that it looks like it kind of just fades out into the distance. And I'm going to do the same thing towards the right side again. So I'm just using that sepia all over the branch, and then I'm going to take a little bit of clean water and spread it out sort of into the background. And if you don't like this look, you can just go ahead and do the whole branch in the same method as the middle part of it. And I'm just helping it blend out a little bit more. Then I'm going with that neutral tint and just dropping that in a little bit here and there to create a little bit of shadow within that branch. Then we'll go ahead and let that dry. And now I'm going to start working on those feathers again while the branch is drying. Now, if you are worried that you might lay your hand in the branch, then you can let it completely dry or use a hair dryer or a heat tool to let it dry, but I'm just going to go ahead and start working on his feathers. So this part I'm going to try to leave in mostly real time so you can see exactly what I'm doing, but I'm just taking that darker mixture that we used for the bottom of his belly, and I'm starting to put in some feather texture. So not every area needs to have a feather, but I want them to be going in the direction that the real feathers are going in, and to just give a hint that there's some texture there. Now I'm taking a little bit of yellow ochre and just a hint of some burnt sienna, and that's what I'm going to use to darken it up further as we get into the darker feathers. So I'm trying to really look to see where the shadows on his belly are, make sure I get those shadowed areas in, and just a few hints of feathers here and there. The most important thing with this technique is just to make sure that the feathers or the fur, depending what you're working on, is going in the right direction. So I'm going back to that neutral tint, and I'm making sure I have a little bit of a darker consistency, because now I'm going to start working on the dark feathers in his face, the dark areas. So the neutral tint will be sort of my base layer now that everything else is dry up there. And then I can go back in with some lamp black just to make some darker textures in there. Now here where it's around his eye, I am trying to make like a little more detail. I'm doing a little more of those flicky motions because this is going to be sort of one of the focal areas. So I do want there to be a little bit of detail right around that eye. So I'm just trying to make sure I flick my brush a little bit into the white areas to make it look like there's little feathers coming off. But I'm sort of being selective with the areas that I do this. And I'm taking that neutral tint too, and I'm just, where the black and the blue meet, I'm sort of making a little bit of a transition where I do a couple little flicks, but I'm not covering the whole area because I want the two colors to transition nicely. And same with the black and the white. So if you want to get those really nice, fine, thin flicks, it is beneficial to have a brush that has a really fine point. So you'll see here I'm using my silver black velvet versus my Princeton Neptune, which is laying on the red rag there. So the silver black velvet has a really nice point to it. All of their brushes come to a really nice fine point. So if I'm looking for something that I need a little bit more detail, I'll choose that brush over the other brush. My Neptune, I find, holds a little bit more pigment, a little bit more water. So I like them both for different reasons. When I'm using this technique, I'll use my Princeton Neptune sort of as my blender brush. So I'll take that, it'll hold, a lot of water in it, so I can use it to blend out areas or to transition areas nicely. And again, I'm just making those little flicky motions into the white feathers, and you'll see it's just creating little tiny gaps within there to create some texture. It doesn't have to be perfect. You could do bigger areas if you want a more looser look, or you don't even have to create the feather texture. You could just lay in the flat color and really, bump up maybe those shadow areas so that you have some really nice contrast in there, and that could be the look that you like. So do what you like to do, It's nice to try out some different styles too, because you never know what speaks to you. Now I'm starting to define his beak a little bit. I'm going to lay in some of that neutral tint, and then I'll go up and darken some areas with the lamp black after. Now I'm not too worried if I lose some of my white areas, because I will go on top with just a hint of gouache to make some highlights here and there. But if you don't want to use gouache, you can always use some masking fluid at the beginning and mask out some of your, feather textures or any white areas that you want to keep, or you can just be extra careful and paint around them. So I'm going to do that in the eye here. I want to keep that top area of the white of the eye there, because even if I go on top with some gouache, sometimes it looks a little weird in the eye. So I like to try to keep that area as white as I can. But the gouache is there to always help if you need it, right? And where it's going on watercolor and gouache is a water-based media, it will still be archival. So I want to take my time with this eye because you can see a little bit of detail in it. The bird is big enough so that I can get in there and get a little detail, so I want to make sure that I focus on that a little bit. And I'm just refining some of those feather textures. Any areas that I think need to be a little bit darker, but not quite black dark, that's what I'm doing. Now I have to say I really enjoyed painting this bird, and I haven't painted many animals in a while. Usually I do them in colored pencil because I like to focus on details and stuff, but I really enjoyed this painting style with this bird, so I think I may end up doing more birds and some more animals in the future. So if you want to see stuff like that, then leave a comment down below and let me know. And let me know if you have any requests for certain birds or for certain animals, because I sort of just, paint what I feel like. If I see a reference photo that speaks to me, then I'll grab it and start painting it or drawing it, depending if I'm using watercolors, watercolor pencils, colored pencils. I sort of like to use it all. So I just, see the photo and then it lets me know what medium I should use. But if you have any requests, then please let me know down below. So here I'm just going in with a little bit more concentrated of that phthalo blue. And I'm going to use this to go on top of the blue areas and create just a little bit darker feathers. And I'm just doing it in a couple areas here and there. I want this to be, not super detailed. Again, just suggesting some detail. And I'm going in with that yellow mixture and just laying a hint of that on the bottom of the tail, because there is a little reflection of the yellow on the tail. So putting that color in there too. So that was our azo yellow, our new gamboge, and then a little hint of yellow ochre. And I'm just using that mixture on his legs too. So I sort of like to use the same colors around in different areas, even though it might not look completely like that. That's what I like to do in my paintings. Okay, so now I'm getting a little bit more of that sepia. And I'm going to work on the branch again. So I just added a little bit of water in there. And now I'm just dropping in that sepia because I want it to be a little bit darker brown in some areas. And I added the water first because I want the sepia to sort of blend out a little bit. I don't want there to be any hard areas just yet in our branch. And I'm going to do the same thing with the right side of the branch and the left side of the branch. But I'm going to be careful to not take that sepia too far down the branch, because again, I really like that blended out into the background part of the branch, so I want to keep that nice and light. So I'm just tapping that into a couple areas where I see some shadows on the branch. And again, I'm going to do the exact same thing to the other side. So I mostly want to darken it up right around his little feet and sort of a couple places on the top and a couple places on the bottom of the branch, so it looks like it's a 3D branch. You know, I want it to give the hint that there is some curve to the branch. So I'm taking some deep sap green now, and I'm just going to add this in a couple little places on the branch as well, just so that some reflections from the greens in the background would reflect onto the branch. And it'll just give it a little bit more interest, having more colors in your branch, but I don't want it to be a focal point, so I'm just using a little bit watered down and just using it here and there, just tapping it in a couple places. But it is a nice dark green, so it'll also add to the darkness of the branch. But it won't overpower it, if that makes sense. And there you just see me putting some clean water down again, because I just want to make sure everything blends out really nicely. Now I'm going in with that neutral tint, and I'm going to do his little legs and his little feet. And I just went a little outside of his leg there. He doesn't need one leg that's a little too big than the other. So I'm just cleaning that up with some tissue paper. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lay the color down pretty flat all over his legs and his feet, and then you'll see me take the damp brush and just lift a couple of areas to make it look like there's a little highlight there, but a subtle highlight. So I'm just taking my time, making sure, you know, I paint, because his little feet are little tiny areas, I just want to make sure I'm taking my time inside the lines, you know. And if you get too much paint and it puddles up, just take your Kleenex and dab a little bit off, because I don't want there to be a puddle on there. Now I'm doing the same thing to his other feet and legs. And I did let the branch dry in between before I did this. I should mention that. I didn't just go right in while the branch is wet, so the branch has had time to dry. Otherwise, you know, once you touch with that color next to the branch, it's going to bleed together. So now I've just gotten my brush, washed it off. You see me wiping the water out of it, and I'm just using a very lightly damp brush to kind of lift up some of that color and create some highlights. Now, because this is such a small area on this painting, it's hard for you to see. If you're having a hard time doing this too, you can always go on top with some watered down gouache or a colored pencil or some gel pen, whatever you prefer to do your whites with. And you could just go on top with that. But I like this method because then, especially on his legs where it's not quite a stark white, not in every area, then this works well for me. And I'm just going and darkening up any areas where I feel like I've taken a little too much color off. And again, I'm just creating some really nice highlights on his little toes as they curl around the branch, just to make it look like some lights hitting there. So I'm just checking to make sure that branch is completely dry. And I'm going to go in with some sepia here. So I'm just getting some sepia, a little hint of neutral tint with it to darken it up just a bit. And you'll see me mixing the two until I get a nice dark, really dark brown consistency. And I want this to be, you know, not too thin but not too thick, sort of a creamy consistency. And all I'm doing here is just making some little lines, some little squiggles on the branch. So it looks like there's some detail in there, but I don't want it to be too detailed, just a hint. And then what I'm going to do is take the Kleenex and just dab off. I'm going to leave that color on there for a few seconds and then dab it because these are staining colors. So I just want a hint of that in the branch. I don't want it to stand out too much, but I want there to be like, oh, you know, maybe there's some more detail in there. So that's all I'm doing, is just making little squiggles, like there's little marks in the wood. And then I'm just dabbing it up. So it's almost barely there, but if you look hard enough, you can see it. Now this might be a detail that you could leave out, but I think it added a little bit to the branch. Okay, so now I'm going to take off this washi tape. And I got this washi tape from Amazon, and I have to say I just hate it. It didn't stick at all. The normal masking tape that I use sticks really well, but I don't know if that's because I took this tape and I only put half of it on, and half of it I sort of went over the side because I didn't want that big of a border. But I'll have to try it again and let you know, but I wouldn't recommend it right now. So now I'm going in with that white gouache, and I'm just going to put in a couple little highlights here and there. So there's this little bit of a lighter area around his eye, and I'm taking a really watered down version of that gouache to do this, because I want it to be sort of a light gray color. And I find it just easier to get that consistency with my gouache. So I have a little blob of the white gouache there on my palette. And if I want it to be pretty thinned out so that it's not very white, I'll do that at first. So all those areas that I want to just be, you know, not quite completely bright white, I'll use more water, less of the gouache. And then as I want it to get a little more thick and I want it to be a little more whiter, I'll mix more of the gouache into my water and get that consistency. So anywhere where it's a little too wet, I just dab it up slightly, or if it got too bright, I just dab it up and just leave a hint of that gouache there. And now I'm just making a little line on his beak where there's a tiny highlight. And I'm also going to take it into a few of the areas where there's some highlights on him and just create some little tiny flicky motions. And I don't want to cover everything again. I just want there to be a hint of highlights here and there. So I'm doing that on the white right now. And then I'm mixing a little bit more of the gouache in so it's a little bit brighter. And I'm going to go down and start to do that in some other areas. So in the black area of him, I'm sort of giving him a couple little feathers here and there to show that there is still some light and to help transition. Now, if you like your bird at this point, you don't have to add this step, but this is just a step that I like to add. Now, if you've got it too thick on your tip of the brush, what you see me there is just rolling it on my palette. And I'm just trying to get, you know, the thickness of it out, because you don't want a thick glob at the end of your tip of the brush, and then you go to put it on and you get this big thick glob. So I'm just making sure I have a nice thin consistency so I can still get those little feather strokes. And I am going to speed this section up just a little bit because it's the same motion as I did with the, you know, when we were doing our other colors. Just doing it in a couple areas here and there so it looks like there's some light catching on our bird. Now you want to be careful into the darker areas. You don't want to bring too much light there and get rid of the darkness. But I find this really makes, you know, some of your pieces really pop nicely. And I'm just hitting a couple of the feathers, you know, around that darker patch to show that they do lift up off of him a little bit. So in the reference photo, those feathers are lifting up. So they have a little bit of a highlight on some of them. And I'm also taking that gouache and going into the blue areas too, because there is a little bit of transition between the white and the blue area where there's a couple random feathers in there. So I'm just trying to transition the areas without doing too much work. And I'm just taking just a little dab in a couple spots on his legs, just where the light's hitting, but I'm making sure that's quite a watered down version of the gouache because, again, I don't want there to be a stark white there where there wouldn't be. Now, if you like that look, go for it. But I want sort of, you know, my brightest whites in the white areas and then sort of more muted whites in the other areas. So here I noticed that the white in his eye is actually not white. It's a very, very pale blue, and it must be the reflection from the sky. So I'm just putting that in now. And yeah, I think that's our tutorial for today. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and like the video. Let me know when you want to see down below. And thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video.